Welcome to another episode of DD on the Spot. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Johnson. Before I get to our guest here today, I'd like to remind everyone that if you appreciate this content, to please give a like and subscribe down below. We greatly appreciate it. We have Gary Jackson on the podcast with us. He has his PhD. He's a behavioral psychologist, and I'm just going to list off all the things that he's done now, and it might take me a while, but he is currently the president and CEO of Ambico LLC. He's a research psychologist who worked within the Secret Service. He was an operational intelligence officer within the CIA. He was a vice president and director of research and development for a major psychological test company. So basically, this guy has done just a wide variety of things. But most importantly, he's our current guest. Gary, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So why don't you give us, we're here to talk about, he was an author of a book also, Surviving Mass Victim Attacks, What to Do When the Unthinkable Happens. And then he also wrote a book previously to that, Predicting Malicious Behavior, Tools and Techniques to Ensure Global Security. I mean, this is all about, helping to survive mass terrorist attacks and just what really goes on in that. So I guess my first question is, what really interested you in this topic to do all the research and write the book?
Well, it's a long story, but I'll make it short. When I started going to college, I started working as a psychiatric attendant in a state hospital of violent individuals. That was my first exposure. And so if you've seen the movie One Who Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest, it was almost identical.
Wow.
So, we'd often find ourselves locked in a ward with 40 patients, all violent. So I had to learn threat assessment very quickly, just to maintain. So that got me interested in psychology. I continued in psychology, got my bachelor's, master's, PhD, and started working with clinical populations. Because I'd worked in the threat environment, I stayed interested in threat throughout my entire career. That's taken me to developing new treatments. And the previous book you mentioned was a result of my writing about the technologies I've invented to detect threat. So artificial intelligence, I put psychology and computer science together. In the course of doing all of that, and of course, you mentioned a couple of places I've been employees of, the United States Secret Service and the CIA. We are interested in other kinds of threat as well. Terrorism, violent individuals coming in to do harm. So it expanded to include a lot of different types of threat, which then leads naturally to mass victim attacks because there are all types. So I focus in my new book on the 5 types of attackers, what their methods are, and what I did differently for this. And it's a combination of my experience and my training, sometimes on the ground doing assessments, sometimes studying, past attacks. But instead of studying just the attackers, I went back and studied how people actually survived. How did they survive? Maybe by accident, but that means that a possible strategy there. So I collected those, put those into strategies, and really 3 things: how to prevent attacks, how to act when you're in an attack, and how do you cope with the effects afterwards.
And I mentioned before that I had a certain connection to terrorism, or to at least terrorist attacks, or this topic, which is what really interested me. So I'll give you sort of the backstory now. So my high school, I went to Bloomington Jefferson in Bloomington, Minnesota, and one of our graduates, Tom Burnett, was one of the passengers on United 93 during 9/11, and he's one of the main people that led the passenger revolt that they had. So at my high school, and my mom actually was in his graduating class. And so at the high school, there was a whole shrine built to him. I mean, most of our football uniforms, there's always been a little patch like on the top right corner for him. And I mean, they have his jersey retired and everything. And the football stadium wasn't named after him, but there's like a certain booth that's named, Tom Burnett booth. One of the strangest things, I should say, I was looking through my mom's yearbook a few years back, and one of the things that they had written in the yearbook section, they had an interview that they did with like Tom Burnett when he was a senior, and they were talking about, what do you want to research when you go into college? Or what is your main interest? And he goes, and the topics was preventing mass terrorist attacks in the United States, which was, that's just irony. That's just irony at its finest, right? So I looked at that and I was like, wow, that's really the thing. That's just unbelievable. So that's really, ever since then, that really has sparked my interest, is having that sort of personal connection to, like every September 11th, when I was in school there, we would all watch a video about him, and just, it was really just an inspiring thing. So that's what really got me into this topic. But, what would you say is probably, out of all of these terrorist attacks, well, first of all, what makes it a terrorist attack as opposed to a different attack? Because a lot of these times, these people are just like, whenever there's an attack, they go, well, isn't that always terrorism? But there is a certain difference. What is the difference to you really between a regular attack and a terrorist attack?
That's really an excellent question. It gets lost on many people because the attacks look the same. They're horrible.
Mhm.
So people say, okay, terrorism. But there are really five kinds of attackers. There's international terrorists, domestic terrorists, self-radicalized terrorists, those that attack out of mental health issues, and those that attack out of hate or revenge. Now, with terrorism, and what makes terrorism different is there's a message.
Mhm.
There's a political message or some kind of message to convey. For example, 9/11. You know, they hit our Defense Department. They hit World Trade Center. I was working in the Pentagon during the time and was just late to work that day.
Wow.
And when the plane hit, and then the people that went down in Shanksville,
Yep.
the person you're mentioning, tremendous effort on their parts to prevent that from happening. So, much respect goes out to them for fighting back. But there's always a message. Now, when there's an attacker that's fueled by hate or by mental health issues, there may not be a message.
Yeah.
In fact, in the Century 16 movie shooting, Holmes, they interviewed him after. He didn't kill himself and he didn't get killed. And he actually, this is a quote, "My message is there is no message." So it's the opposite of terrorism, which says, we did this for ISIS. We did this against the United States. If it's domestic terrorists, like the Oklahoma City bombing, was very upset with the government. So there's always kind of a message to be left there, whether it's stated or not. So that's primarily the difference. I will say also, in massive terrorist attacks, they're basically a little better organized, hence 9/11. So the effects can be pretty bad, even when self-radicalized. We had Omar Mateen at the Pulse nightclub and 49 dead. That went on for hours. And so there was a message. He was even on the cell phone during the attack. But for those who are really mentally ill and just hate, there can still be a message, but it's not a political type of message.
Yeah, I always sort of like to make the distinction between, like you said, Oklahoma City, that was clearly a domestic terrorist thing because he was mad at the government. He was trying to send a message. But then you get other attacks like Columbine, where it was just kids that were just really angry at their students and their other peers, and they just wanted to inflict as much harm as possible. Where that's not such a direct message. That's just more of releasing. And that's what a lot of these school shootings are. I mean, a lot of these kids that, especially they get captured, I mean, they don't have like any affiliation with anything where they just say, I did this for this. It's just, I was feeling angry. I was feeling upset. So I did this. And it seems like nowadays that these terrorist attacks are going up, but I do always like to sort of point out that they have always been happening. It's just that with the news media now, the coverage has been getting more and more widespread. While there have been, more mass casualty events, but I always sort of like to point out, there was that attack in Texas in the 1960s.
Yes.
With, I forgot what his... Yeah, Charles Whitman, yes. There's a documentary on that I saw that was very, very fascinating where, I mean, he basically took up this spot in a tower. And the interesting story about that is that, most civilians then got out their guns and started shooting back at him. And that's what really, stopped him from committing a lot more acts. But it's been going on for a very, very long time. But why do you think it's currently going into more of a spike where, as like the media seems to cover it, like these mass shootings, for a lot of people, it just seems like they're never ending?
Yeah, it does seem that way. But 2 points. In my research, looking back at mass attacks, which really can be shootings, we tend to think they're shootings, but not always. Bombings can be stabbings, and now vehicle rollovers at Al Qaeda and ISIS's request. But in 1927, a man by the name of Andrew Kehoe was upset because he didn't get an election and was in financial trouble, blew up his house with his wife in it and the local school in Bath, Michigan.
The Bath schoolhouse bombing. Yeah, I've heard about that. Yeah.
Scores of children, and himself.
Yeah.
So it does date back a while in terms of mass attacks, and we tend to define them as 3 or more, because there's so many criminal murders and violence that we have to separate some way. And so we tend to look at mass attacks as 3 people killed or more, and so it seems to be rising, and it's kind of cyclic. For example, since I had finished up my book, I kept tracing and tracking mass attacks. So since the end of April, we've had 10. Well, that's a lot. Out of those 10, we've had 66 deaths and 67 wounded. That's just since April. They tend to be a little smaller. They're not 9/11s, fortunately, but they're serious, they're devastating, and they've occurred in many places, including houses of worship, malls, you name it. I mean, basically, mass attackers, when they decide to attack, they want to go to a nearby location that has a mass of people there. Sometimes that's the target. Just let me kill as many people as possible. It does seem to be increasing at times, but you've made a really astute point. It's been going on for a very long time. And we've had the Charles Whitmans, in the 60s. And, it dates back, as I mentioned, to 27. But it's still here. And I think one of the reasons it is, we do get a lot of media coverage more than we used to. And we do get copycats. We do get people who want name recognition and to fulfill whatever it is up in their head that could be happening, that they perceive the world differently. And so until we make better inroads into identifying these people earlier, and the interesting thing is, Ryan, there are almost always warning signs, almost always, but they're not acted on. And we have to learn to prevent by not being afraid to report. And in the book, I mentioned most people don't want to report family, friends, but you can report anonymously. And I show how to do that. Anonymous reports better than no report. And some of these could have been stopped, perhaps. And by the way, many have been stopped.
Oh, yeah. Ever since 9/11, I mean, I couldn't even imagine, probably the hundreds upon hundreds of attacks that have been foiled that we, as the public, just have no idea of, where they could have been, 10 times worse than 9/11, or just, I mean, all this stuff that gets released years later, even decades later. I mean, I even think, it's not related to terrorism, but the one time that we accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb on North Carolina, or dropped 2 of them, and they failed to explode because they weren't primed or armed. I mean, just stuff like that. We have no idea of the things that they have helped prevent. So just for everyone out there who complains about, all these attacks happening, I mean, there's so many more that could have happened. And this is kind of a question that I don't think you might not have got a lot, but it really seems to interest me. Some of these, I mean, we have a guest coming up in a few weeks. He was sexually assaulted by John Wayne Gacy as a kid. He survived, but that just got me into thinking about serial killers and mass murder killers. Could mass murder or serial killers, could that be considered a form of terrorism if there's a message behind it? Kind of like maybe like a Zodiac killer, where he was just about, showing it up to the system, and maybe just showing just how, how people can't really find him, or just leaving those messages where, like, you can't find me, I'm too smart for you. Could some of those be considered domestic terrorism, or is that all just basically just in the mental health, murder psychosis sort of mindset?
Yeah, another excellent question. So if you take the serial killers like Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy and these individuals, you're talking about some mental health issues, and whatever it is that drives them, as perverted as it might be, and it usually is very perverse, they do not get satisfied until they've killed that next individual. I interviewed a person who had killed 98 people. He's in a facility for the criminally insane, and you don't hear about him because he's locked up. And I interviewed him because he made a threat to the president, even though he's locked up. Those have to be investigated.
Yeah.
And so I talked to this individual for several hours, and he was quite calm, talked normally. And I knew what his trigger was, and I had to test it. And so at the last statement, and I'm glad some Secret Service agents were with me at the time, I said, because his trigger was mother, believe it or not. So I said, well, all I can say, thank you for your time, but I must say your mother must have been very disappointed in you. So it took several people to pull him off. So, it's so strong in their heads that it doesn't matter what goes on around. They're perceiving the world differently, and they're going to continue. But serial murderers are basically going to stop when they get stopped. They continue, and it's very unfortunate. Whereas the mass attacker wants to kill as many at one time, because the point is to get that message out. It's terrorism. And if you're killing one quietly and then another one next month, it doesn't get out in the press as much. So they're looking for that media coverage as a way to glorify what they've done. And many of them, as you are aware, are prepared to die or kill themselves, or suicide by cop, as we call it. They keep going until the cop or the law enforcement stops them. It's not as often that we see individuals that aren't being stopped and they just, okay, I give up. It does happen, but not as often.
Yeah.
So, but they're different. And I've also looked at serial murderers quite a bit because there is a distinction there. And so I've tried to focus first on these mass attackers because we're seeing more of them, it appears. And so we're watching. And for example, I mentioned since April, we're having one on an average about every 21 days. So that's, since April, that's quite a few. And they're pretty horrific. So we would like to see them go down. But I think without the public helping with reporting these warning signs, and one of the things I've tried to explain is we've all heard the phrase, see something, say something. But when you talk to most people, they say, what am I supposed to see? And what do I say? And who do I say it to? And there's a distinction there. Local law enforcement wants to hear about suspicious behavior, and you should go to local law enforcement. If an attack is imminent, 911, you want to call 911. But a lot of people don't think of using their local law enforcement, and you don't want to wait until the incident is going to happen, although it does. But then what do you do in that incident is, the other piece once it starts. And I think the one piece that people do forget about is what happens afterwards. I use the term mass victims because in these attacks, even if you're not injured, you might have acute stress disorder or PTSD for a long time, and you might need to seek treatment for that, even if you weren't actually wounded. So some people suffer these severe anxiety, issues when they witness an attack.
Well, you don't even have to, like I said, you don't even have to be there because even after like 9/11, just the fear of flying on planes, a lot of people just even got stressed who weren't even in New York City or weren't even in any of the hit areas. I mean, and that's the goal really of the terrorists is usually just to, inflict as much damage as possible and to cause fear and hopefully have us change our lives. But now, who are these attackers? Because, let's face it, whenever people hear about terrorism, the number one thing that comes into their head is Islamic terrorism, for, I'd say 99% of the people that they think of, but it's a wide variety of things other than just that. Who are these terrorists mainly, and what motivates and inspires them to do these deeds?
Well, as I mentioned, there are 5 kinds that I've identified. For example, workplace violence you can throw under hate and bias, but the terrorist types, the 3. So the international terrorists, we pretty well know. There's a lot of publications about ISIS and Al Qaeda and the international terrorists. This relatively new category we have of self-radicalized. Here's a person in the United States, perhaps, who identifies as a soldier of ISIS and may have never contacted ISIS or been contacted by ISIS, and may have as well, or through internet. Internet has made it very possible to communicate with people that you want to belong with. And of course, these groups are going to say, yeah, go out and kill many people in our name, use vehicles, run over them, stab them. Because you don't need any special skills to do that. You don't need to know how to shoot a gun. You don't need to go get a special knife. Just take your vehicle or rent one is usually what happens and run over as many as you can. And we've had over 100 killed in these France, just by one truck. And it's relatively easy to do. And even if stopped, they'll often get out and start stabbing. So they become hybrid attacks. So the terrorists are one group, and of course the domestic terrorists, to go along with the international and the self-radicalized. As we mentioned, the Oklahoma City bombing, someone who's just really upset with the government and they want to make a strong statement. But then we jump into those other 2 categories, those who are mentally ill. Now, usually and if you look at the cases in which this has happened, for example, the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting was awful. 20 children killed, 5 and 6 years old, 5 adults, plus his own mother. And if you look at his life before the attack, he isolated himself. He didn't appear relatively normal like other people. He hung pictures of attacks in his room, antisocial. And his mother actually bought the guns to take him target shooting with, which he used to kill her before he drove to the elementary school to do the nasty work there. So a lot of it's going on in the head. We can't see it. and they need early reporting so that someone can talk to them before they do the act. James Holmes, the Century 16 movie theater attacker, was in psychiatric. Well, he had been seen by a psychiatrist before he did the act. And sometimes they don't want to do it, but they need someone to stop them, you know. And then we have that last category, the hate, the bias. You know, we had the recent Temple of Life shooting of the Jewish synagogue, and he hated Jewish people very much, wrote about it. And when he went inside the synagogue, as he was shooting anybody he could find, he was saying that Jews need to die. I need to kill Jews. That's a pretty hard one to deal with. But, you know, that just doesn't happen when he walks in the door. There are signs of that earlier. So I'm trying to increase the vigilance around us, that when we see something highly suspicious or threatening, that we report it, even if it's an anonymous way. But those are the kind of the motivators behind these people. In some cases, when I look at a case, if it doesn't make any sense, my first reaction is, okay, let me look at the mental health issues, because the outside world might not be what caused this. It might be what's going on inside. So we see some strange ones sometimes. They just do not make sense. Others are very clear. Yeah. 9/11, unfortunately, was very clear. And they had their message.
People have been mentally ill and mentally sick ever since the beginning of time. I mean, people have always had, you know, these weird fantasies. Some people have always, you know, had that impulse to just attack others. But it just seems like, especially in this day and age, just a lot more people are doing it. And I kind of like to sort of bring up a little story that my dad always used to tell me. I mean, just saying how different things used to be back when he was going to high school in the 70s. He grew up in southern Minnesota in a small farming community. And when they would go to school in the mornings, especially during the spring and in the fall, kids would pull up in their trucks, and they'd have shotguns and rifles in the back of their trucks because they'd have gone hunting earlier that morning, or they're waiting to go hunting later after school, and the school would just let them. I mean, they would have their trucks usually unlocked, or some of the guns would be just on their stands outside of their cars, and they just have their shotguns and rifles just outside in the parking lot. And I mean, it was just one of those things where, you know, everyone back then, I mean, if you were a hunter, I mean, and no kids really didn't seem to ever really have that urge. What do you think really is taking and giving more kids these days? Because let's face it, back then you did not have these young kids committing these mass shootings, or you did not have a lot of these shootings that we're talking about. These kids now would just seem to be a little bit more of the loners. Or another good point is that one guy made a very interesting point where he said people back then normally just seemed to take their own lives then, as opposed to then deciding to take other people's lives with them. So what do you think really has caused that change to make people want to inflict pain on others as opposed to just doing it on themselves then?
I think there's a lot of resentment. You know, we've had a few cases where young men have killed women in a mass attack, saying, gee, I never really had a date, irritated, you know, I'm angry, I'm going to go kill some to get back at them. So there's often a revenge motive to this. And it's flashy to kill a lot of people at one time that you don't like, so that you can get the recognition. And, you know, you don't mind if you're an attacker that has those issues. If suddenly the press is talking about you, they're giving your name, it's on the news, because you were a loner in most cases. And now you've got all this attention. So it's unfortunate, but the more that we see of those, the more the potential attackers see of those and think, maybe, gee, I could get some recognition, because this isn't working for me now. I'm not getting any recognition. And people have treated me unjustly. I'm going to get back at them. And I think we see a lot of that. I agree with you. I mean, when I went to grade school and even high school, if I had brought a pea shooter or a slingshot to school, you know, I would have been in detention for a week. You know, we're picking up guns in schools now, not that infrequently. Now that goes back again to prevention. So where does a kid get the gun if they're not hunting? Okay, where do they get that gun? Is it locked up? Do the parents bear responsibility for keeping those guns safe? You know, and in some cases they're not. They might be a loaded gun under the pillow, you know, for safety, protect the home. But then there's the 9-year-old kid who gets it, and, you know. So it does happen. It has changed. I think we have to look at the world differently now. I often say when I was young, we had front porches. Everybody sat out on their front porch at night, Neighbors walked by, they visited, and then suddenly they're gone.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm not blaming TV and I'm not blaming video games. Like, the world has just changed.
Yep.
And we're much more localized now. It's easier to be in that loner situation because other people aren't seeing it. They're locked away in their room, unfortunately. And it has to be up to parents and friends to help out in these situations. Because at one point I've made, if it's your own child or spouse, wouldn't you rather report anonymously and protect his or her life as well as innocent victims than to have them go ahead and commit an act? And another key point, I think, and this is important because we're talking about mental illness or mental health. Because someone's mentally ill or they have mental health issues doesn't mean they're violent. Most aren't. But when we see many of these acts, they have some form of mental health problem. But we have to be careful not to generalize too strongly and say, well, that person's different. They must be dangerous. Just typically not the case.
There's so many cases, like you always say, like you've been talking about this whole time. Report, 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 even if it's anonymously, all these cases, every single time. I mean, there might be like one out of a few hundred where you see where there were like no warning signs, where the guy just might have just snapped and then went off and done something. But other times, almost all the time, there's so many warning signs where people just reported and just realized and said, hey, this guy needs help. He needs to get looked at. He needs something, to just go and report them anonymously. So many people's lives over these past decades could have been saved, where it's just, that's the one message that we can get out here. It's just report, report, report. Even if it brings harm, even if you might feel bad about it, even if it might cause you to feel some grief. I mean, it's the right thing to do. So now let's play a scenario where, you're in a scenario that happens to be a mass casualty or a mass attack event. I mean, obviously there are going to be different ways as to survive maybe a shooting as opposed to a bombing, but are there any general ways for any sort of attack? Are there any general strategies that really would help someone's increase their likelihood of survival?
Absolutely. I go through 4 types of strategies. Escape, number 1. Some people call it run. I call it escape because the definition of escape is you're leaving a place of danger to a place of safety. So, first of all, if you have a choice, escape. Always. Get out of there. Hide comes number 2. And hiding isn't, let me go hide in the restroom because there's no exit. So there have been many attacks where there have been a number of people killed in the restroom because they run in for protection and there's nowhere to go. So you have to think about this and where you're going to hide. And hiding really should be temporary until you can actually escape. To be hiding, the person's reloading, get out of there. There are rare times to stay in place. Rare. If there's a bombing and you were not injured, you might want to stay in place because there's not likely to be a bombing right next to it. But there might be one a block away, which actually happened in the Boston Marathon bombing. They were a block apart, 18 seconds apart. If you had run when the first one went off and just happened to run you might have run into the second bomb. Plus, if you're staying in place, you might be able to treat your own injuries or others people's injuries. And along with that, everybody should take a first aid course for your whole life. I mean, it helps in 100 different ways, but especially in this, you could bleed out if injured. And the absolute last one is fight back, attack back. You don't want to have fantasies that you can attack a terrorist and take him down if he's standing there with a semi-automatic pistol or rifle shooting and you don't have anything. The chances are on his or her side. So there are strategies, but there are a lot of sub-strategies. For example, a lot of people think I'll go run behind the door and close it, lock it, and then stand behind the door. Bullets go right through a door.
See, but here's what I always said. I was one of those kids who would always bring up a topic. My strategy would have always been, now I know that this could be wrong now, but just this was my thinking back then, was I would stand like at my high school, for example. That's one of the places that we'd always, well, first of all, for my high school, they did the thing where, you run into a classroom as soon as possible. But if I always said, so a lot of my classes were right by a door that would lead me out of the school, that was like right out of school. So I said, if there's anything like that happening, I'm not running into a classroom. I'm getting the HE double hockey sticks out of there. I don't care what any teacher tells me. I'm running out there. I'm running as far away as possible. But one of my things was, because we had like concrete protecting the sides of the doors, I would have either me or someone else that would grab the sharpest thing that they could have and like stand right to the left or to the right of a door. So then as soon as someone would open that door, if it was a terrorist or a school shooter or anything, and they had their gun in, then I would like reach for the gun with one hand, pull it down, and then go for him with my sharp object with the other hand. That would just be a strategy that I would do. Now I know it wouldn't be, that's not, something that everyone could do, but that's just my strategy. But I mean, yeah, obviously don't hide behind a door, because that is not the brightest idea, because it can shoot through bullets. But yeah, just those are all great tips. But I mean, when it comes to these people that do survive, like you said, a lot of them follow these certain steps, but there's always these freak accidents where people just survive just through luck and chance. How much of a factor does luck and chance also, do you think, play into surviving a lot of these attacks, though, too?
I have to say a lot. Mm-hmm. So in the past attacks, and I've looked at pretty much all of them and how people survive. Let's say there's an attack and you happen to be standing by the exit at the time. Okay, what are you going to do? You're going to jump out the exit. But that's also a strategy. So I go into a lot of detail about having your own personal security guide. That means when I walk in a place myself, it takes me about 10 seconds. Now, I just automatically, it doesn't mean I'm afraid. It just means I know where the exits are. I know where the windows are. Should I have to break one out with a chair to escape? I know if there's an upstairs, downstairs, where not to go. And for example, I've said a lot about malls.
Yes.
So it's interesting. We've had mall attacks, and people tend to think when you come into a mall, and let's say there's an attack, first thing you think of is the exit or entrance you came in. Well, every store, not necessarily every store, almost every store, has a back exit. Mm-hmm. It also has places to hide as you go through the store to get out that back exit. It's a lot closer than running through the mall to that front entrance or back entrance.
Yep.
So, some of this is common sense, but when there's an attack and you're not prepared, you don't think about things like that. So the more you think about it, although we don't want to think about it, but the more you think about where are the exits, where can I hide, where can I go in case something happened? And that's especially true if you're some kind of caretaker in that public place. So if you have children, 6, 7-year-old children, what are they going to do? An infant. If you have your elderly parents, you're taking them to the mall. Okay, you can't just run. You're responsible for some other people. So in those cases, look around, see what's available to escape, or if it has to be to hide. But those are all important points. I remember one case in particular. It was a school shooting, college, and the young man was hit. Most of the people in the classroom were killed. The shooter went away, and he was going to come back. So he and one other student who were not killed, even though they were wounded, slammed the door shut, and they couldn't really stand, so they lay down on the floor and held it shut with their feet. Mm-hmm. Sure enough, bullets came through the door, and he had on a jacket, a leather jacket, which had 3 bullet holes in it. One was where he was wounded. The other 2, the bullets actually went through the jacket and out without hitting his body.
Wow.
So that brings up strategies of how to hold that door shut. Even a wallet or wallets jammed under that door can hold a door fairly well if you really jam them. So doors, run to a place if you're going to barricade yourself in. Make sure you can close and lock that door. That's if you just simply cannot escape. Mm-hmm. And that does happen. In the Pulse nightclub, a young lady ran this. That went on for hours. So did Columbine, by the way. It went on for hours. Mm-hmm. So you can't say, okay, I'm going to hide because first responders will come and take care of me in the next couple of minutes. They might arrive, but they have a nasty situation on their hand. Guy could have hostages, so you have to rely on yourself. And we've had really great first responses occur. But think about yourself. How are you going to protect yourself or your family if you're with your family? And you just have to think about that these days. Yeah. It's a little different. And if you're in a mass gathering, even if you're walking along the street, one point I've made, if you're walking along the street, even if you're traveling, because we're getting a lot of these vehicle attacks, they just run over you. Put away the cell phone. Put the earbuds out. You need your senses just to be safe, even for normal car accidents. So, people need to pay attention. It doesn't mean you're doing it out of fear. It's like getting in your car and putting on a seatbelt, or getting on an airplane and putting on your seatbelt. There are just certain safety measures, and you need your ears and your eyes and senses to these days.
Absolutely. And you brought up malls, and I always like to say, my hometown, I'm literally 3 miles away from Mall of America, the biggest mall in the country. So, I mean, I always hate going there. I mean, I always try to avoid it because I always know that is probably, if there's a target to attack where I'm from, that's probably the target to do. I mean, even on the international list, they did a list of like the most targets that they wanted to hit the most in America. Mall of America was in, I think, like the top 10. I think they released one year. So then after I saw that, I was like, yeah, I don't want to ever go to that place ever again. But it's just, yeah, so that really does, really hit home. But when it comes to also, like you said, the first responders can sometimes take a long time. What are some reasons behind, like, if there was, say, like, I know that one of the reasons why Columbine took so long is because it was the first, like, one of the first, like, attacks in a long time that happened like that, where they didn't really know what to do. But on situations like Pulse or other situations where it might take a while, what is the reasoning behind that for them taking so long and just not just bum rushing the school in?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. For example, Pulse nightclub in Orlando, that went a while because he locked himself in the nightclub, had hostages. So if you're a first responder and your thought is, okay, we have to get this guy, but he's also going to kill everybody he can, when we start raiding, you start strategizing. Well, that all takes time. And he was talking. So sometimes you have a negotiator. So these things take time because your goal is to save as many lives as you can that are left. And so it just kind of depends on the situation. And it really is that. All situations are different. They really are.
Yep.
Whether it's a school or a nightclub or an inland regional center in San Bernardino where the self-radicalized, those people went in and killed their fellow workers, who'd even thrown her a party because she was going to have a baby earlier. So, it's interesting because we also need good training. So, for example, they were trained to drop in case of an attack. They had training like a couple weeks earlier. They dropped. There were 3 exit doors in the room they were in that weren't used. I can guarantee you what my choice would have.
Yep.
I would have tried to make it through the exit door, and it's an unfortunate incident. But we need training. Any facility that has people, hospitals, you saw it recently at Mercy Hospital in Chicago. Great response there. Police reacted quickly. They got the guy. He killed 2 people. One poor lady, young lady, was walking out of the elevator, but they made an announcement, a code announcement in the hospital. People were prepared, and otherwise there would have been a lot more fatalities. So that training pays off, but we need to make sure it's the right training. And I stress it's not on internet in 5 bullets, so to speak. So you need to be careful and get adequate training from people who know what they're talking about. One thing I've warned against is if you're in a mass attack, you don't necessarily listen to the loudest voice because it can sound reassuring. Everybody run over there. And then everybody, think for yourself what's going to protect me and give it some thought before you go into public places.
Thank you, because so many times we hear just like, listen to so-and-so, listen to whatever, do it. It's like, no, some of these times the people that you think you should listen to know as much as you do about the incident. So you never know. It's always, think, what would I do in this situation? I mean, as selfish as that can seem, but I mean, it's about saving your life first. Just like if you're going to get into it, just like if the airplane is going on and your oxygen mask comes down, you put yours on first, then you can help out other people's. That's exactly the same thing that I would think should apply to school or to mass attacks. But now this brings us into a topic that, I mean, it gets brought up every single time there's an attack. I mean, even without them being used, guns. I mean, even if it's a bombing, people somehow like to bring up guns as a topic. They think, guns are the huge issue. I mean, without guns, some of these people believe that without guns, I mean, we would be the most peaceful society that's ever existed on the face of the earth. And, as that might think to some of those people. But in your opinion, are guns the problem?
No. I will say we have a lot of guns.
Yep.
We have 369 million guns in this country. Mm-hmm. We only have 330 million people. So we have many more guns than we have people. And because many people don't have guns, that means that those people who have guns may have 8, 9, 10, 11
Hmm.
guns, and they're enthusiasts. There's nothing wrong with
Yep.
that. People do believe strongly in protecting the home,
Hmm.
and we're seeing more concealed carry guns out there now. Even some churches have people with concealed carry to stop some of these church attacks. But we have to remember that mass attacks aren't just guns. We do have dreadful bombings. I mean, 9/11 was the worst incident we've ever had.
Hmm.
Airplanes were the weapon. We have mass stabbings. It's easy to get an eye, you know, in the runovers.
Hmm.
And so if the guns weren't there, in my opinion, after studying this for, decades, they would use something else.
Hmm.
And something else doesn't mean it's not as bad. I talk about the future, which I don't like to talk a lot about because I don't like to give any ideas. But, you know, there's chem bio, there's other kinds of things that can be devastating other than gun. The one thing I will say about guns, and I'm not choosing either side of the gun debate, I'm just saying we have had incidents stopped because of the gun.
Yep.
You have a mass shooter. His goal is to shoot as many people as possible. You're not going to talk him down.
Hmm.
It's going to take force. And, I think we're not going to maybe carry guns, but there are things we can do. I mentioned in the book, we can use personal protection devices. So I have a little can of pepper spray, it fits in my pocket, where it squirts 15 feet. If it came down to it, I'll take it.
Yeah.
And they're legal in all 50 states, although there are different restrictions. You need to look at your own state. But if it really came down to it, that's debilitating. You can debilitate someone. So there are things that we can do, but I'm not suggesting that everybody carry a gun by any means.
Yeah.
You need to be trained and good at carrying a gun. It's too easy to buy one, perhaps. And we're getting people slipping through and purchasing guns when there's a history of behavior that should not allow them to have a gun. And they're getting them legally. They're purchasing them legally. So if there are strong mental health issues with past violent behavior, in my opinion, that person should not have a gun. So we have to tighten up, I think, in terms of our gun regulations. But with 390 million out there, you're not going to take those back.
Yeah.
It's just not. We have to be realistic. It's not going to happen.
Hmm.
So
Absolutely.
yes, and unfortunately, we do have to meet force with force if we're going to save people's lives.
So, like, we kind of touched base on it a little bit, a few seconds ago, but like you said, what do you think the future is going to look like? Do you think that eventually we will be able to somewhat stop a lot of these attacks from happening? Or do you see it as, people are just going to find ways, regardless of how we prepare, to at least injure people?
If we could start a campaign that would state, not see something, say something, but more specific, how to report, what do you report on? And people did more of that. I actually think we would see a decrease because we'd be getting early intervention. And early intervention can be very important for the person. Like I mentioned, sometimes the person doesn't really want to do it, but they're compelled. You mentioned the serial killers. I mean, Ted Bundy is a good example. He just was compelled. He had to do it. And, but once in a while, if these individuals are in treatment or therapy or counseling, that might be enough, if it's done correctly, to know the warning signs, help the person. And if you can't help them, then you're going to have to detain them if they become a real threat. So I think they can go down, but they're not going to go down without better preventative measures. We've even had high level, I don't want to say who, we've had high level government officials say, gee, there's nothing that can be done with mass attacks. I just looked at the news screen with my mouth open. I couldn't believe it because we've had, last count I had was 60 that have been stopped. There's much that can be done, but people don't know. And just because you're a government official or maybe even law enforcement doesn't mean you know that. So we need a better way of getting the message out. And And I think a better way of protecting these facilities that have masses of people at one time, churches, malls, bars, grills, restaurants, anything where a lot of people could come, they need to go through, okay, here's how I look at it. If I look at one of those places, I look at it in terms of, if I'm inside and someone just called me and said, okay, there's a mass shooter 30 seconds away, what would you do? First thing you do is look at the door. Is your door safe? Can you lock it? Second thing, where can I go in here to be safe? Okay, there are some windows, there are some exits. That all can be done beforehand and not when you just get a tip. It's just anytime you go into a public facility, let me do a little homework, even if it's 10 seconds. I like to face the door when I sit down at a table. There have been a few occasions I didn't feel quite comfortable, given maybe the area I was in. And I've asked, I'm the customer. So I say, no, I don't want to sit there. I want to sit over there. Oh, okay. They usually don't say no, And I like to face the doors. I like to see, there's simple things, and many of them are common sense. But I think perhaps the best way to decrease the number of fatalities and injuries is to be aware of what could happen. And there's something that happens in these attacks, and for 3 or 4 seconds, you're just stunned. You're looking around, and God forbid someone doesn't pull up their cell phone and start taking videos. It's not the time. If you're aware of what could happen, that interval of time where you're stunned can be decreased, which can give you more time to get out.
Yep.
So you should be prepared, and it's not a horrible message where we're trying to scare people. It's just that you need to be prepared and be ready.
The likelihood of you being involved in a mass attack is very, very, very slim, but just always be prepared because you never know. I mean, I can guarantee all the people that have been affected by terrorist attacks mass attacks, they never even knew that they'd ever be encountered in one of them. So, I mean, it's like, always be prepared. I mean, I always like to do sort of like the visual check where whenever I walk into a place, I do the same thing like what you're talking about. I check out the exits, and then also I watch people walking in. So if I see someone looking super distressed or you can tell people's body language is what they might be inferring.
Absolutely.
So that's what I always like to do as well. And if I see someone that's really stressed out, then I keep my eyes on them for a while and just make sure that, like, maybe it's a guy who just was in a breakup with his girlfriend where he's just trying to just de-stress about that. But I just always put a few more seconds on him just to make sure that it's not something that could be harmful to everyone in the building. So it's always things that you can do. And for people who are interested, where can they find your book, Surviving Mass Victims Attacks? Is it available on Amazon, other sources? Do you have it? Is it available on all those places where people can buy it?
It's on Amazon and other places as well. The publisher is Roman and Littlefield. They also have it, but Amazon is probably the best place to look.
Now, I have to mention out there for everyone, though, that I do work at UPS, and it is peak week. So if you're going to order the book, please wait about 2 or 3 weeks to order it until peak week's over, because that's doing more work. That's doing more work for me, and I don't want to have to stay, an extra couple of minutes. So in about 2 or 3 weeks, then you can obviously go and buy his book, Surviving Mass Victim Attacks. I mean, I highly, highly recommend it. It's a topic that I know people don't like to talk about, but like some other topics, you need to get aware of what's happening, and you need to know and be better prepared to survive, because like he said before, there's always going to be like a 3 or 4 second window for a lot of people where they don't know what's going on, or they're just in a daze. Like you see those moments in war movies where the camera angle just slows up really, and then everyone's just they're just in a daze just because you can't comprehend what's happening to you. But if you're better prepared, I mean, half a second is all it takes between a life or death scenario between you. I mean, bullets traveling, if you were maybe half a second farther away, or if you were half a second, I mean, it can be the very, very difference between surviving and dying in an attack. So it's very, very important. And again, Gary, we cannot thank you enough for coming on the show. Is there any current books that you're going to plan on writing on? Or are you going to take a break from writing, or what's the process like there?
I'll probably continue, but I'm bouncing around with 2 or 3 of them now. One thought is, since I've written this book, it is more in terms of how to focus on your physical facility. Mm-hmm. What can you do to make sure it's safe, which seems like a logical follow through, but I have some other things bouncing around too, so we'll see.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and if you do write one, definitely get a hold of me. I would love to have you back on to help promote that book. I mean, I hope people that listen to this learned a lot, because I mean, it is one of those things that I really, really love to bring awareness to. And we can't thank Gary enough for coming on. I mean, it was a really, really great guest. And everyone, I mean, I'll leave a link to all of his books down below. His books, that if you want to buy them, down below, I highly, highly recommend them. Or I'll leave a link to all of his other stuff down below, so you can keep an update what he's been up to. And just, I mean, just learning that he was working with the CIA and the Secret Service. I mean, that is just cool enough as it is. Lastly, I'd like to ask, when you were working with the CIA or the Secret Service, what are some really good tips that you picked up from them, from the top people up top, when it comes to these mass attacks? What were some tips that you got from them as to maybe like location wise? Are there some certain ways that you can just slowly change and adapt things in your lifestyle to help prepare yourself?
I think that one of the best things I learned was it was drilled into me on how to be aware. Awareness.
Yep.
As I mentioned, put the cell phone down. If you're out in public, I was at a restaurant recently, and it was almost amusing. There was a family of 5, 3 kids, and mom and dad. They didn't talk. Everyone had a cell phone. If somebody had run in the door with a gun, well, it would not have probably been a good scenario.
Yep.
So I think, when you work in the government, when you work in law enforcement, you keep an eye in the back.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be aware of what's going on at all times. And I think that's just good advice for anybody anywhere these days.
Yep. It's
be aware.
Like I always say, it's really hard to sneak up on a cop or anyone that works in Secret Service. They're probably one of the people, if you're trying to scare them, that's one of the things. Well, obviously don't do that, but if you're trying to, they're one of the hardest things. I mean, they seem to be able to hear things that most normal people can't hear. So, I mean, and that's just everyone, awareness. We cannot preach that enough. And again, you guys, Gary Jackson, cannot thank him enough for coming on the show. Thank you so much. And honestly, we wish you nothing but the best in all of your futures endeavors when it comes to writing your books or doing anything that you do in life. I mean, thank you so much for coming on. You've really, really enriched a lot of our guests, and me in particular, just by talking about this, and I can't thank you enough. And is there anyone that you would like to give a shout out to, or anyone that you would like to give a message to before we wrap things up?
Just to you, I'd like to thank you for the invitation and helping me spread the word, because I think there are things that we can do. And I think what you're doing is incredibly useful. So thank you, Ryan, for that.
Absolutely. I'm glad to do it, and I'm glad to have awareness on. So again, you guys, all of his links down below. And this is Ryan Johnson, DD on the Spot, signing out. Have a great day, everyone.